Hey there. Today we're talking about the romantic life of medieval people. Not the fantasy version, not kings and castles, but the quiet, earthy love that happened in villages, near streams, beneath trees, and behind wooden doors. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the year is 1327. The sun is setting behind the hills, casting long golden light across the fields. You're walking through soft grass, barefoot, the earth still warm from the day. A woman waits for you beneath a tree, her dress made of coarse linen, her sleeves loose, her hair falling in braids. She doesn't speak. She just smiles and pats the ground beside her. You sit. A quiet breeze moves the leaves. The whole world is slowing down. This is what love felt like hundreds of years ago. Before we begin, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? We love seeing how far this sleepy little community stretches across the world. Love in the Middle Ages was not fast. It wasn't flashy. It was built like everything else in that time, by hand, over seasons, and with quiet patience. Most people lived in small villages where everyone knew everyone. So if two people were drawn to each other, it wasn't a secret for long. Romance began with glances at the well, quiet conversations while tending sheep, or shared work during harvest. He might notice how she tied her headscarf, how she laughed at something simple. She might notice how he carried water without spilling a drop, or how he always waited for the elderly to pass first. There were no flowers from shops, so if a man liked a woman, he might leave her a small token, a sprig of rosemary on her doorstep, or a carved button made from bone. If she kept it and didn't speak a word, that meant she felt the same. Marriages were often arranged, but not always without love. In peasant life, many couples chose each other, especially when families had little land and little to lose. Even in arranged marriages, affection could grow. Love came after work, in the soft moments of rest, not grand gestures. A touch of the wrist when passing bread. A long look across a shared chore. A private smile while the rest of the family slept. People slept close, not always from romance, but from necessity. Houses were cold. Beds were small. But within those limitations, something tender often bloomed. They would talk quietly before sleep. They would share body heat beneath wool and straw. There was no privacy, but there was trust. And sometimes there was passion too, expressed in whispered jokes, stolen kisses, or hands that met under the table during meals. Love in the Middle Ages was filled with problems, distance, jealousy, parents who said no. The church had strict rules, and some forms of love were forbidden. Still, people found ways. They met in secret. They sang love songs at festivals. They used flowers to send messages, gestures to speak when words were too dangerous. But the most beautiful love wasn't loud. It was found in silence, in a shared walk back from the fields. And a girl pressing herbs into her lover's palm, then turning away, smiling. And a man brushing straw from her hair without needing to speak. This was romance, medieval style, close to the earth and soft as candlelight. Weddings in the Middle Ages were rarely grand. Especially for peasants, they were practical, quiet, and deeply local. There were no diamond rings, no music composed just for the occasion. But still, they carried meaning. They were sacred, simple, and deeply tied to the earth and the seasons. Most weddings took place outside, in open air, near a chapel, under a tree, or in the field behind a cottage. The couple would often stand with just a few witnesses. A priest might be present, or not. Sometimes two people simply declared their vows aloud, in front of others, and that was enough to bind them. There were customs. Tying the couple's hands together with ribbon or cloth called a handfasting, sharing a piece of bread, or placing a sprig of greenery in each other's hair, a symbol of new life. There was rarely a white dress. Instead, the bride wore her. That swollen gown, often dyed deep green, soft red, or faded blue. The neckline might be a little lower than usual. She might braid her hair in a special way, wrapping ribbons or tiny flowers between strands. Not for vanity, but for meaning. He would wear a fresh linen shirt. He might shave just this once. And he would look at her like he was seeing the sun for the first time. The wedding night was rarely private. In peasant homes, there were no extra rooms. Sometimes they shared the bed with children or even livestock nearby. But still lovers found ways. They waited for silence. They whispered. They touched with care. The first night was not always a moment of passion, but it was often a moment of tenderness. Learning the warmth of another person's skin, the sound of their breath slowing down beside you, the feeling of waking in the middle of the night and knowing you weren't alone anymore. Over time, romantic bonds deepened not through drama, but through habit. They worked together, ate together, slept close. They shared silence, and that was often the most romantic thing of all. He might warm her shawl by the fire before she woke. She might fix the rip in his tunic without telling him. And neither would call it love, but it was. They didn't write poetry, but they remembered the way each other smelled, the way hands felt when resting on the same table, the way a glance across a field could carry more meaning than 1,000 words. And if love faded, they found ways to rebuild it through shared work, quiet forgiveness, and the passing of seasons. Because in a world without distractions, where life was slower and everything had to be done with your own hands, love was something you built, not something you waited for. Asterisk before. The wedding, there was the waiting. The quiet, uncertain time when love was new and every glance meant something. This was medieval courtship, not like the courtly poems of lords and ladies, but the slow rituals of working people who fell in love with calloused hands and watchful eyes. Young men often noticed girls during chores, at the market, drawing water, walking beside the hedgerows. They rarely spoke directly. Instead, they watched. And they waited. In most villages, everyone knew everyone. So a boy couldn't just walk up and flirt. He had to be subtle. He might offer help, lifting a heavy pail, repairing a fence, or sharing a piece of bread during feast days. Small gestures filled with intention. If the girl liked him, she might respond in ways just as quiet. A glance held a moment too long. A sprig of thyme tied to her basket handle. Thyme meant desire. A braid in her hair placed in a certain way, known only to those who noticed. There were tokens of affection, handmade things, often carved during long winter nights. A wooden pendant, smooth and round. A woven thread tied with herbs, a dried flower placed in the thatch above her door. She might keep it. She might pretend not to notice. But everyone in the village would whisper. Touch was rare and powerful. In a time where modesty was strict, even accidental contact meant something. Hands brushing while passing tools. A finger resting too long when handing a cup. It sent a message when neither could speak aloud. There were meetings too. None in grand gardens, but behind barns by moonlight. Lovers might walk together along the edges of fields, careful not to be seen, but hoping someone would notice. Anyway, some met at the well before dawn. Some passed notes, not written in words, but in knotted threads and symbols. A red ribbon folded 3 times. A stone shaped like a heart. A bundle of rosemary tucked between bread loaves. They weren't allowed to say, "I love you." But they found ways to say it without saying it. Still, courtship had risks. If a girl was caught in secret with a boy, her reputation could suffer. Her family might stop her from leaving the home. Whispers could lead to punishment or forced marriage. That's why many lovers move slowly. They build trust, not just romance. They helped each other's families. They brought food in hard seasons. They proved themselves, not with words, but with time. For some, love was never allowed to blossom. Two people might feel something deep and never act on it. Instead, they lived next door to each other for years, married others, and only looked back decades later, when both were old and their hands had long since stopped reaching. But for those who were lucky, love turned into partnership, slowly, and without saying it aloud. They understood something rare. Even in a hard world, love had a place. Love in the Middle Ages was not all mystery and stolen glances. Once two people came together through marriage or circumstance, romance shifted into the rhythm of daily life. And that rhythm was slow, physical, and filled with small, tender rituals. A couple would often rise before the sun. The cottage was cold. The fire needed coaxing back to life. She might move first, draping a shawl around her shoulders, pulling on wool stockings, stepping barefoot onto the packed dirt floor. He would stir as the room filled with the scent of ash, smoke, and rising bread. Their mornings were quiet. A few soft words, or none at all. The sounds of clay mugs on wood, of spoons in thick porridge. Sometimes he would tuck her braid behind her shoulder without speaking. Sometimes she would smooth his shirt as he stood by the fire. The medieval home was small. A single room, often shared with animals. Walls made of timber filled with straw. Light came through cracks, through oil lamps, through the open door. And yet, for lovers, it was enough. They worked side by side. In the field, they would pass tools without needing to ask. Inside, she might spin wool while he mended rope. Each chore was a rhythm, and within that rhythm was comfort. Affection appeared in gesture, not words. A hand resting on a shoulder, for a second longer than needed. A pause while handing over a bowl, fingers touching, eyes glancing. In private moments, he might kiss her hair while she stirred stew. She might rest her head on his arm while they watched the wind blow outside. There was no concept of romance as we know it today, but there was closeness and care and the kind of love that needs no performance. And when the day ended and candles burned low, they would lie down together. Their bed was a wooden frame filled with straw, covered in wool. The air was cold, but their bodies were warm. They lay close, not just from desire, but from habit, from survival, from trust out sometimes. They whispered. Sometimes they were quiet. Sometimes her hand would rest on his chest, his breath slowing under her touch. They had no music, no privacy, no soft beds or perfumes or silks, but they had each other's skin, each other's breath, and the long comfort of being near. And in that dark room, with the coals slowly dimming, love was not spoken. It was lived, asterisk, in the Middle Ages. Love was shaped by the seasons. Because life followed nature, and so did the heart. There were no calendars in the cottage. But lovers knew what month it was by the sound of the wind, the weight of the sky, the color of the leaves outside their door. Springing spring, love felt new. It was the season of festivals, dances, and shy glances. Fields were being tilled, lambs were born, and flowers returned to hedgerows. Young couples might meet in the meadows while gathering herbs. A man might weave a small crown of daisies for a woman's hair, not for beauty, but because she laughed when he handed it to her. They worked side by side, soaked in sunlight, mud on their boots, but light in their eyes out at night they would lie close, listening to the sound of frogs and dripping roofs, their skin smelling of earth and smoke. Summer in summer, love was strong. It had to be because the work was endless. Harvests began. Days were long and heavy with heat, but there were soft moments too. She might bring him water in a clay jug, cool against his lips. He might shade her with his cloak when they walked through open fields, There were stolen moments of affection, in barns and tree shade, in corners of the day no one else saw. Their hands were sun-browned, their faces flushed, but when they looked at each other, they felt a kind of peace. Autumn and autumn, love became quiet. They prepared for winter together. They salted meat, dried herbs, and patched wool. She mended holes in his tunic without him asking. He stacked extra firewood for her knees to warm by. There were fewer smiles, but more touches. The fields went brown. The air turned sharp. But at night, as they lit the lamp and shared bread and broth, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with fire, just presence. Just knowing the other was near. Winter, and in winter, love became survival. The cold was deep, and the nights were long. Wind howled through the thatch, and sometimes snow blew in beneath the door. They wrapped themselves in furs. They ate what they had preserved, and sometimes they went to sleep hungry, but they slept together. They held each other through shivering nights. They whispered under thick blankets. They remembered spring Dot sometimes. They didn't speak for days. But when he reached out for her hand under the covers, or she turned her back to press against him, nothing else mattered. Over the years, love in the Middle Ages didn't burn fast and die out. It grew slowly, like ivy, winding through seasons. Through sickness, through hunger, through joy. Dot, she would watch his hair go gray at the edges. He would see her hands grow lined from years of weaving and washing, but still they shared everything. The bread, the blanket, the bed, and in the quiet of evening, as the fire crackled and the chickens settled outside, he might still reach out and touch her cheek, as he did when they first met. No words, no need, because in a world where everything was hard, love made it softer. Love in the Middle Ages did not end with youth. It simply changed like everything else in that world. The body slowed. The hands stiffened. The hair turned pale. But if two people had spent a lifetime together, there was still warmth. Still closeness. Still desire, though it spoke in different ways. In medieval villages, people aged quickly. By 40, many had the aches of old age. By 50, some were already considered elders, but within the walls of their small homes, older couples still slept side by side, still bathed one another in warm cloth water, still reached across the bed in the dark to find the other's hand. Intimacy became softer, quieter. Not urgent, but meaningful. She might sit behind him and comb his hair. He might place her feet in his lap while she spun yarn. There were no mirrors, no thoughts of perfection. The body was seen daily in work, in childbirth, in illness, so there was little shame in its change. They saw each other wholly, without judgment, with love that had been earned over years. The fire was still lit, the blankets still shared, and when their fingers touched, even after all that time, it still meant something. In some homes, love came late in life. After a widow remarried, or after two older neighbors began sharing bread, then stories, then silence, then nights. It was not a passion of youth, but it was no less deep. He might bring her eggs from his hens. She might leave dried herbs for his cough. And one winter night, he might fall asleep in her arms, and neither would call it romance. But it was. In medieval culture, people rarely spoke of love as we do. There were no romantic words carved on stone, no books written by common folk, no vows about forever, but they showed it. In washing each other's backs, and rubbing aching hands with sheep's tallow, and letting the other speak or sit in silence, and facing hunger, birth, winter, and grief together, and never walking away. Love in the Middle Ages was not always beautiful, but it was real. Not always poetic, but deeply physical, grounded, human. It was a shared blanket in February, a half loaf of bread given when you were hungry too, a hand on the shoulder after a long day, And when one of them passed, the other would sit by the hearth, quiet, holding the empty cup, remembering a lifetime of small, invisible tendernesses, because, in the end, even in a world of hardship, love left its mark. In calluses, in memories, in warmth that lasted long after the fire went out. And that's how love lived in the Middle Ages, not in poetry, but in patience. Not in fantasy, but in the quiet acts of everyday care. Asterisk love in the Middle Ages was imperfect. Even in a world of silence and slow days, the heart still stirred with doubts, with longing, with feelings too complicated to name. Not every couple was always close. Sometimes, even in the same room, they felt far apart. Jealousy existed, not loud, or dramatic, but quiet and aching. If a man looked too long at another girl at the well, if a woman smiled at a passing peddler with kind eyes, there might be no argument, no spoken word. But that night, their hands might not touch under the blanket. Their voices might fall. Quiet at supper, people in that time rarely spoke openly about their feelings. There were no romantic speeches. If someone felt forgotten or distant, they carried it in how they moved. A slower step, a bow placed down a little too hard, a look that lingered just a moment, then turned away. But the pain was real. In a world where couples needed each other for food, for firewood, for shelter. Emotional distance could feel like a storm inside the house, and there were other challenges too. Long absences. Some men were taken to war or seasonal work. Some women were sent to distant households for service. Two lovers might be separated for months, with no letters, no voice, just the memory of a hand once held. And yet, even in pain, love found a way to speak. A woman might wait at the edge of the path each evening, hoping to see her husband's shape return from the fog. A man might carve her name into the wood of a tool he used every day. Not to be seen, just to feel closer to her. Rebuilding closeness took time. Sometimes it came in shared silence by the fire. She would hand him a warm drink and sit, not looking at him, but not far. He would let their arms brush as he passed behind her. Sometimes it was a soft word. "Are you warm enough?" Or a gesture, laying her shawl near his side of the bed. In a place and time where most emotions were kept inside. These quiet repairs were more powerful than poetry. Not all jealousy came from fear of others. Sometimes it came from hunger, from exhaustion, from feeling unloved in a world where survival left little time for tenderness. A woman who felt ignored might braid her hair more carefully the next day. A man who felt forgotten might bring a small gift, like a slice of honeycomb. And without saying a word, they would begin to find each other again. Because in the end, love in the Middle Ages was not about perfect happiness. It was about staying, even when it hurt. About learning each other over years and choosing again each day to reach out instead of turning away, even in a storm, even in silence. Even when the fire was low and the room was cold, they would lie down together, and sleep would come, and in the stillness of night, one hand would quietly find the other. Asterisk. In the Middle Ages, most people lived close to nature. They woke with the birds. They walked barefoot in fields. They bathed in rivers, watched clouds pass, and fell asleep to the sound of wind through the trees. And so, for many lovers, nature was part of their love story. It was their privacy, their poetry, and their companion. They didn't meet in bedrooms or gardens. They met beneath trees, old oaks with heavy limbs, where moss grew soft and the shade cooled the skin. There, a man might sit beside a woman and say nothing. Just breathe beside her. Just lean slightly closer than before. Rivers held special meaning. Clear, slow streams that wound through the countryside. Quiet places where lovers could wash, talk, or simply look at their reflections side by side. A woman might lift her skirts to her knees, stepping gently into the shallows. A man might watch her from the bank, pretending not to look too closely. They would laugh at the splash of cold water, and sometimes their fingers would meet beneath the surface. The wind carried secrets. When they were apart, she might say, "He's in." The wind today, as if the breeze brushing through her hair carried a memory of his voice. Rain was not a burden. It was a moment of closeness. When the skies opened and the fields went dark, they might run together beneath a cloak, laughing, breathless, soaked through. Then sit beneath a wooden ledge, him wiping her face with a sleeve, her tucking her hands into his for warmth. The stars watched everything. At night, when the animals slept and the house was still, two lovers might step outside, just for a breath of air. They'd look up at the sky thick with stars and feel small and safe. Sometimes he would point to one and say, "That one is yours." She would say nothing, but remember which one he meant. Seasons shaped affection. Spring meant herbs and flowers, tucked into small tokens. Summer meant long walks, slow kisses, and sleeping with the door open. Autumn meant shared baskets, picking apples, drying lavender. Winter meant keeping close all day, all night. Because outside was ice, but inside was firelight and wool dot, there was no word for romantic getaway. But they still found ways to escape together, to sit on a hilltop at the edge of the village, to lie in grass and trace the shapes of clouds, to listen to birdsong and say nothing for hours. Nature was their sanctuary. The only place where no one watched, where hearts could open like petals, and time felt slow and gentle and kind, because love, real love, has always needed space. Not distance, but quiet. Not privacy, but peace. And from medieval lovers, the forest, the fields, the sky above, they were all part of the love itself. Asterisk, in the Middle Ages, most people couldn't read. There were no love letters on scented paper, no inked poems. Remember, heart-shaped boxes or silver bracelets, but lovers still found ways to speak without words, without writing, just through things they made and what those things meant. A man in love might spend hours carving a small object by hand, a button from bone, a ring made from braided leather, a tiny wooden bird, not to impress, but to offer, quietly, wrapped in cloth or left where she would find it. He wouldn't say, "This is for you because I love you." He would just place it in her palm and wait for her eyes to meet his. A girl might gather a bundle of herbs, tied with a strand of wool, thyme for affection, lavender for devotion, rosemary for remembrance. She might press it into his hand before he went to market and say only, "This will keep your pockets sweet." Even a piece of bread, baked slightly differently, a heart shape pressed into the top, a little honey folded into the dough, could be a message they spoke through. Careful gestures, through offerings that could be denied if needed, but also treasured. Sometimes a token was shared secretly, passed hand to hand under the table during a meal. A feather, a stone, a ribbon, a lock of hair wrapped in cloth and hidden in the folds of clothing. People didn't say much, but they remembered everything. Where they found the gift, the look on the other's face, the warmth in their chest that lasted long after. There were hidden symbols, too. A red thread tied in a knot 3 times. A flower left upside down on a windowsill. A bowl placed outside. The cottage at a certain time of day. Everyone knew what it meant, but no one said a word. Sometimes a gift wasn't an object. It was an act of service, fixing a broken cart, touching water before dawn, mending a torn shawl when no one asked. These were the gifts that mattered most, because love in the Middle Ages wasn't just a feeling, it was a practice. It showed itself in hands, not mouths, and work, not words. in remembering what someone needed before they asked Dot, and if the love wasn't returned, the token would be left untouched. The bread uneaten, the carved figure handed back, but even then, the offering itself was a kind of love, brave, gentle, quiet, because in that world of silence and soil and sweat, a single handmade gift could say everything. I notice you. I carry you. In my thoughts, I offer you something made from my time, my hands, and my hope. In the Middle Ages, touch was precious. It was limited by modesty, by culture, by the simple fact that most people were almost never alone, that when two people loved each other, they found ways, and every moment of closeness meant something. Too. Touch someone's hand in public, at the well, during work, was not ordinary. It was a risk, a message, a spark. A girl might brush her fingers against his when passing a basket. A man might place his hand on the small of her back, just for a second, as they crossed through a crowded path. It didn't need to last. It just needed to be felt. In private, affection unfolded more freely. Not in loud moments, but in the in-between, after a day's work, while kneeling by the fire, or in the hush before sleep. He might tuck a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. She might rest her head on his shoulder, letting out a breath she'd been holding all day. He might press his palm to her waist as they moved past each other in the cottage, not for desire, just to feel that she was there, that there were no ground. Romantic embraces. But there were small ones, a hug from behind as she kneaded dough, an arm around his chest as he chopped wood at dawn, a shared blanket wrapped tight across both shoulders when the fire had burned down low. These were the real expressions of love. Sometimes lovers touched with intention. After a long absence, after an argument, after fear or sickness, he might sit beside her and gently place her hand in his lap and not let go. She might take his face in her hands, thumbs grazing the stubble on his cheeks, and say nothing. Just look. In those moments, nothing else in the world existed. Even during sleep, touch remained a language. Two bodies lying side by side on a straw bed, breath sinking in the dark, feet brushing beneath wool. He might reach for her hand under the covers wordlessly. She might curl toward his chest, pressing her ear to his heartbeat, and rest there until morning. In illness, there was a different kind of closeness. She would wipe his brow with cool water. He would lift her gently to help her drink. These weren't grand acts of love, but they were intimate, and they carried more devotion than 1,000 kisses. Even modest people, bound by rules of the church and community, touched with meaning. A thumb over knuckles, a shared breath before a kiss, a hand resting on the other's back for just a little longer than needed, because love in those days was not spoken easily, but it was felt fully, deeply, and quietly through the skin, and in a world without words for passion or romance. Two hands meeting in silence could still say, "You are mine, I am yours, we are safe." Asterisk in the Middle Ages. Life was ruled by forces people could not explain. The sun, the rain, the illness that came without warning, all were seen as part of a grand, hidden pattern. And so was love. They believed some hearts were simply meant to find each other. That love, like the moon or the seasons, followed a path deeper than words. Villagers spoke of threads that tied one soul to another. Invisible cords that stretched through time and distance, tugging gently, pulling lovers closer even before they'd met. They believed you could feel when your other half was near, not in your mind, but in your chest. A warmth behind the ribs, a stillness in the air around you. There were folk signs and quiet omens. If a girl dropped a spoon and it landed upright, they said a suitor was on his way. If a boy dreamed of a certain flower 3 nights in a row, his bride would wear that bloom. In her hair. If two people reached for the same cup at the same moment, it meant their futures were already tied. dreams held special power. In sleep, the veil between worlds felt thin. A woman might dream of walking through a forest and finding a stone, and the next day, she'd meet a man with eyes the color of stone. A man might hear a voice in his sleep call his name, soft and unfamiliar, and weeks later hear it again, from a stranger who smiled. These dreams weren't questioned. They were accepted, written down not in books, but in stories shared over fires, passed from grandmothers to granddaughters. There were simple love rituals, whispered from one generation to the next. On Midsummer's Eve, girls might place herbs beneath their pillows, mugwort, thyme, and fern, to see their true love in a dream. Boys might tie knots in grass, thinking of the girl they longed for. If the knot stayed tight overnight, it meant her heart was steady. No proof. Just hope and faith. People didn't use the word soulmate, but they believed some people fit. The way two puzzle pieces made from the same branch might click together. After years apart, and when they met that person, the one who made chores lighter, who laughed the same way, who remembered what you loved without needing to ask, they didn't question it. They just stayed, because in that time, love didn't need to be explained. It only needed to be recognized, in the dream that stayed with you for weeks. In the feeling that the river ran differently when they stood beside you. In the way your hand closed more easily around theirs than anyone else's. They believed that some hearts were born already waiting. And when they met the one they waited for, they didn't rush or announce it or write it down. They simply stepped into the same path and walked forward together. Love in the Middle Ages could be soft and slow, but not every story ended in togetherness. Some hearts drifted apart. Some were broken suddenly, by distance, by silence, or by death. And when that happened, there were no songs to play, no letters to write, just quiet days and longer nights. A young woman might stand at the edge of a field, watching the road where someone once walked beside her, now empty. A man might return to the cottage they once shared, find her apron still hanging on the door peg, but no voice. Waiting inside, no one spoke the word heartbreak, but everyone knew what it looked like, a face that smiled less, a person who stopped singing while working, a pause in the middle of a sentence, as if waiting for someone who wouldn't answer. There were no therapists, but there were rituals of letting go. Some would walk alone to the edge of the village, leave behind a token, a ribbon, a carved piece of wood, and never return to that spot. Some would whisper a name into the wind, then press their lips. Shut for days, as if sealing it away. Others turned to the land. They worked harder. They planted. They wove, letting their hands carry the weight their hearts couldn't hold. Some people never loved again. They lived full lives, but kept one cup, one shawl, one seat by the fire untouched. Not out of pain, but out of quiet. Memory. For those who lost love to death, grief was different. It came in waves, in the way one person now carried two people's tasks, in the way the bed felt bigger, in the way their name echoed too loudly when said aloud. The village watched. Quietly. No one asked questions. They simply left bread at the door, offered warm broth, and walked with them when the days felt too long. Healing did not come quickly, but it did come. One day, she would wake and feel hunger again. He would chop wood and not stop to wipe his eyes. Someone would laugh at something unexpected, and the sound would surprise them because it came from their own mouth. Sometimes love returned. Not like before, but gentler, wiser. Two people meeting not in firelight, but in the calm after rain. At other times, love never came again, but peace did. Because in the Middle Ages, people knew the heart was part of the body, unlike a broken bone. It could ache in cold weather. It could carry pain silently, but with time and warmth and care, it could still hold weight, still hold light. still hold love in a new shape, asterisk in the Middle Ages. When two people shared a life together, sometimes love led to a child. There were no announcements, no painted rooms or clever names, only a slow shift from two lives joined, an affection to 3 and then 4, and then more. There were no guarantees. Birth was a fragile, sacred thing. But when a child was born into a home warmed by love, the whole rhythm of life changed. She became a mother and he became a father, and both became something else too, a part of something larger, something growing. Babies were swaddled in linen and wool, cradled by hands callous from work, but gentle nonetheless. They slept beside the hearth, beside their parents, hearing the same breath that once beat through the womb. There were no lullabies written down, only hums and stories whispered. At dusk, in the heartbeat of the one who held them, a child born of love didn't just carry a name. They carried a piece of both parents, her smile, his voice, her temper, his laugh. In quiet moments, the couple would watch their child sleep and see echoes of their earliest love, the day they met, the nights they shared, the hopes they once whispered under oak trees. As the child grew, the work grew with them. She might hand the toddler a wooden spoon while she stirred the stew. He might lift the child onto his shoulders while walking through the field. There were no toys, but there was learning, how to plant, how to knead, how to speak softly, how to love by example. Love, in this form, became less about each other and more about what they were building, a home that stayed warm through winter, a place where small hands were always welcome, a life where love didn't need to be said, only shown. Sometimes the couple would lie together at night, the child asleep, between them, and they would reach over his sleeping form, finding each other's hands in the dark. There was less passion, perhaps, but more peace, more comfort, more reason to hope. And as their children grew, left the house, started lives of their own, the parents remained, two people who had grown old through love and now sat by the same fire, sharing bread, remembering the sound of tiny feet across the floor. Because in the Middle Ages, love didn't end at romance. It expanded. It stretched into generations, into the shape of children's hands, into the long memory of the home. In the Middle Ages, love did not vanish with age. It settled, softened, changed shape, and as men and women became mothers and fathers, then became grandparents, the love they once felt as young lovers was passed quietly, like a folded cloth, into the hands of the next generation. In small cottages, grandparents were often part of the home. They slept near the hearth, wrapped in wool, their days slower but still full of purpose. They watched their children raise children. They heard echoes of old lullabies and new voices. They saw gestures, a kiss to the temple, a hand rested on a back, and remembered when that same love was young. They didn't speak much of the past, but they carried it. A grandmother might mend clothes with stitches her mother taught her. A grandfather might show a child how to hold a knife, how to sharpen it, just as he had once learned under a tree long ago. With his own father's hand over his. Love passed down in gestures. The way bread was kneaded with care, the way water was poured gently into a cup, the way a child's name was spoken softly, even when they'd done wrong. These things were not taught. They were absorbed, watched, learned by doing. Sometimes, late in the evening, grandchildren would sit cross-legged on the packed earth floor and ask their grandmother, "What was your wedding like?" And she would smile, brush flour from her apron, and tell them of a walk through the forest in spring, how he gave her a carved spoon instead of ring, how they danced barefoot by firelight. These stories weren't written down, but they were remembered, tucked into minds, retold years later under different roofs, to different children as time moved slowly on. The old didn't speak of love with grand words, but their lives were made of it. Their hands still reached for each other, even with joints stiff and eyes dim. They sat close in the evenings. She would tuck a blanket around his knees. He would hold her hand while the stew simmered. No need for passion, only presence. And as their hair whitened and the seasons turned again and again, the love they had known, the slow, tender, enduring kind, was passed forward. Not as rules, not as lessons, just as a way of being, because in the end, the greatest love stories were not told with candles and poetry. They were whispered in kitchens, folded into linen, taught in how to hold a baby, or how to say someone's name with warmth. And so love lived on. Not in history books, but in hands and hearts and homes. Asterisk in the Middle Ages, music lived in the corners of life. There were no radios, no records, no written notes in the homes of peasants. But there was rhythm, always, in footsteps, in the beat of dough on a wooden table, in the hush of a hum while spinning thread. And where there was love, there was music, even in silence. Some couples first noticed each other during festivals. A fair in spring, a feast after harvest, a slow dance under lanterns made from dried skins and candlelight. The music was played on pipes and strings, simple instruments carved from bone or wood. The melodies were old, passed down by ear, but the steps were new each time, and when two people danced together, they learned more than words could say. She might notice the way he moved, light, unsure, then bold. He might feel the steadiness of her grip in his hand, the rhythm of her breath as the tune picked up. Sometimes they didn't speak again for weeks. But that one dance remained, a quiet music between them whenever they passed in the lane. Music was woven into daily life. A woman might sing while milking the goat, just loud enough for the man outside to hear. A man might whistle while splitting wood, a slow tune she once hummed in the dark. They shared lullabies, simple melodies that wrapped children in sleep, but also wrapped the two of them in peace. He might rock the baby, singing a tune his mother once sang to him. She would smile softly, recognizing the notes even before they left his lips. Some couples created songs just for each other, not full songs, but a line, a phrase, a rhythm tapped on the table when words felt too heavy, a beat on the doorframe. Before leaving, a whistle across the field, a hum beside the bed before sleep, even when love was quiet, when words had run dry, when days were long, music still carried the bond. On stormy nights, they would sit close, and one of them would hum an old wedding song, or a tune from the village where they first met. No one danced. No one clapped. But something in the room warmed again, and when one of them passed, the other sometimes sang the old songs alone, in the garden, by the fire, to the air. The music lived on, and so did the love, because in the Middle Ages, love had many voices. But music was one of its oldest, a rhythm of daily life, a note passed hand to hand, a hum beneath the breath when the heart was full. In the Middle Ages, life moved with the seasons, and so did love. There were no calendars hanging on walls, no dates written down, but lovers knew what time it was by the air, the fields, the sky, and how they felt in each other's arms. Spring was the beginning, everything green, everything soft. Lambs in the pasture, blossoms on the trees. A time for glances, for shy smiles over baskets of herbs, for hands brushing and passing. Lovers would walk where the grass was still wet in the morning and speak little. Just listen to birdsong, watch petals fall, and breathe the same damp air. Summer was longing, hot days, sweat on the back of the neck. Work from dawn to dusk, they saw each other less. The fields demanded every hand, and the sun left them too tired to speak, but love still lived in brief moments. A drink of water handed gently, a shoulder leaned against under the shade of an elm, a stolen kiss behind the haystack, while the bees hummed nearby, Autumn brought harvest and closeness. The baskets grew heavy, but so did hearts. There was pride in what they had made together. Grain stored, cider pressed, wool spun, and folded neatly Dot in the evenings. They would sit side by side, feet tucked beneath the same blanket, watching the smoke curl from the chimney. Sometimes he would place his hand over hers without a word. Sometimes she would rest her head on his arm. Dot. It was the season of quiet love, rooted. Warm, steady. Dot. Winter was the most intimate. The world shrank to one room, a hearth, a bed layered in furs. There was no field to run to, no market to visit. Only the two of them and the long dark nights. Love in winter was slow. She would mend his tunic by candlelight. He would warm her, boots by the fire before she woke. They'd share porridge and stories, speak softly to avoid disturbing the hush outside. Sometimes they would sleep all through the storm, their feet touching beneath thick blankets, waking only to shift closer. Other times they would lie awake in the dark, listening to the wind press against the walls, grateful they weren't alone. Each season taught something different. Spring taught hope. Summer taught patience. Autumn taught gratitude. Winter taught closeness. And love, real love, was learning to move with the rhythm of it all. They did not speak of it in poems. They simply lived it, felt it in the changing sky, the way clothes were folded, the way a kiss meant something new in each kind of air. Because in the Middle Ages, love didn't just live in the heart. It lived in the wind, the rain, the fire, and the frost. And it changed again and again, just like the world around it. Asterisk in the Middle Ages, many kinds of love began with silence. And many strong loves were kept alive by it. Not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said. Words were scarce in their world. People spoke when work required it, when instructions were needed, when prayers were whispered or blessings passed. But lovers, especially those who had loved for many seasons, learned to speak differently. They learned to speak through looks, through timing, through presence. A man might notice the way his wife sighed as she stirred the pot, and without a word, take the spoon from her hand. A woman might see the lines on his face deepen as he returned from the field, and place warm bread beside his bowl before he sat. These small gestures were not romantic in the way songs describe, but they were deeply felt. There were times they would sit beside each other for hours by firelight, on the edge of the field, beneath the eaves during rainfall, and say nothing, but in that silence, they felt closer than if they'd spoken 1,000 words. When you live with someone through harvests and storms, illness and joy, the space between words becomes sacred. A silence before bed might hold the memory of the first time they touched. A pause after supper might carry the weight of shared loss. A look across the room might say, I see you, I know you. I'm still here. Silence was not emptiness. It was trust. To share quiet without fear. To be together without needing to fill the air. To breathe in time with someone else and know they will not walk away. Young love burned fast and spoke loud. But old love, the kind that grows slowly, learned to speak through patience. It showed up in the way she handed him a cup. The way he rubbed her shoulder when her hands ached. The way they both watched the same flame and remembered the same night. Without saying so. Even arguments passed differently in such love. No shouts. Just quiet space. A longer walk. A meal eaten separately. Then a hand rested gently on the other's back later that evening, asking forgiveness without words. In that time, love aged gently. It did not fade. It deepened. And in the stillness between two people who had spent many winters together, there lived a kind of peace that can only be found when silence feels safe, because in the Middle Ages, a long, quiet life beside someone was not boring. It was everything they hoped for. And in the hush of a shared room, while snow fell outside, Two people could sit in silence and say, I love you, I love you, I love you, again and again, without ever speaking. In the Middle Ages, love was rarely spoken aloud, but it was visible in the way two people worked side by side, day after day, season after season. There were no weekends, no time away from chores, no long mornings in bed. Love didn't grow in luxury. It grew in motion, a woman at the spinning wheel, a man mending fence posts, a pair of hands sowing seeds, another guiding the plow beside them. And when those hands belonged to people who loved each other, the work was softer, lighter, more full of meaning. They might wake before dawn together, share a crust of bread, and step into the field without needing to speak. One would carry the tools, the other would carry the water, and together they would face the rising sun with quiet understanding. Work was a rhythm they shared. She would sweep while he chopped wood. He would stir the pot while she gathered herbs. They moved like gears, different, but turning the same wheel. It wasn't always even. Some days he worked harder, some days she did, but there was never keeping score. Only the sense that the load was lighter when the other was near. Even small things carried care. She might wash his shirt at the river, scrubbing slowly, then let it dry in the sun, just so he might carve the handle of her broom smoother, so her hands wouldn't blister as easily. These weren't gifts. They were acts of quiet devotion. In the long afternoons, they might work side by side in the garden, not talking, just listening to the wind. She would hand him tools before he asked. He would steady the ladder when she climbed. And in those moments where hands were dirty, backs were sore, and the sun hung low, there was often a glance, a pause, a smile that said, we're doing this together. In the winter, shared work meant survival. He would bring in firewood. She would dry the herbs. They would both kneel by the hearth, hands busy, shoulders touching. And as the stew simmered and the snow fell beyond the door, they would feel the closeness that came not from desire, but from shared effort. Love in their world was not about escape. It was about staying, showing up each morning, lifting the same bucket, holding the same rope, trusting the other to pull when your grip slipped. And when the day ended, and the tools were hung, and the floor swept clean, they would lie down together, tired, quiet, and full, knowing they had built something, even if no one else could see it. Because in the Middle Ages, love was not just felt in the heart, it was held in the hands, and bread kneaded, and walls repaired, and tasks done without complaint, and two people working in rhythm were often closer than any two who only ever sat and spoke. Asterisk in medieval life, love was rarely a perfect story. Just like today, it had moments of uncertainty, and one of the most quietly felt emotions was jealousy. People didn't use the word the way we do now, but the feeling existed. A flicker in the chest when someone lingered too long in conversation with another. A silence that stretched a little longer than usual. Life was hard and attention was precious. When two people shared affection, even small shifts in tone or routine could be felt deeply. And yet, open arguments were rare in villages where privacy didn't exist. Everything had to be handled subtly. If trust was shaken, it was repaired slowly, not with dramatic gestures, but with consistency. A full bowl left out for supper, a coat patched without asking, eyes meeting again after days of glancing away. Trust wasn't proven in promises. It was proven in patterns. Loyalty, too, meant something different in the Middle Ages. It wasn't only about fidelity. It was about being reliable, being present, holding one another's burdens across days, across years, through planting seasons and bad harvests. A loyal partner was someone who noticed when your hands were tired, who stayed after a loss, who remembered how you liked your stew even after 20 winters. People didn't say, "I'm yours." They simply behaved like they were, but even so, love could be tested. Sometimes one partner would leave for weeks or months to trade, to travel for work, to follow the Lord's campaign. And the one left behind had only memory to hold on to. Letters were rare, word of mouth traveled slow. In those weeks, loyalty meant doing your part, even when no one was watching. And when the traveler returned, there was always uncertainty. Had they changed? Had something shifted? But again, love rebuilt itself not in declarations, but in action. By the way boots were placed by the door again. By the way, sleep came easier when two people breathed in the same room again. There were no guides for navigating these feelings. No books to help you understand the ache of doubt or the quiet joy of reunion. People learned by example, from watching older couples, from witnessing what lasted and what didn't. And often, the lessons were simple. Speak less, listen more. Let time do the work. And above all, be there, because in the Middle Ages, love didn't require perfection. It only asked that you stay through the shifts of the seasons, through storms and silences, through missteps and mended fences. And it was this quiet, ongoing loyalty that became the most enduring form of love anyone could offer. In the Middle Ages, life was uncertain. Illness could come quickly and accidents happened without warning. But for those who lived long enough, those fortunate enough to grow old together, love changed in ways that were quiet and meaningful. It slowed, deepened, and settled into the bones. The urgency of youth faded, and what remained was something softer. A kind of companionship that didn't need to speak loudly to be felt. Older couples in the village were often seen moving more slowly through their tasks, but they still worked. She might sit at the edge of the garden, sorting beans into neat piles. He might mend a rope or carve handles for new tools. They didn't rush, and they didn't hover. They simply existed near each other, sharing space, breath, and memory. Their conversations were short, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything important had already been said many times before. They remembered the harsh winters of their youth, the hungry years, the births and losses, and they remembered each other through it all. They didn't celebrate anniversaries, but they marked time by the lives they built, the shape of their home, the strength of their children, the echoes of laughter from long ago. Growing old together wasn't something many people expected. Life was too fragile, but for those who did, it was often seen as a kind of quiet reward. Neighbors treated older couples with respect, but also curiosity. Young people would ask questions about how they met, how they stayed together, how they managed hardship. And often the answer was simple. They never left. Not during hard seasons, not during grief, not when love became less exciting and more routine. They simply remained as the body aged. So did the way people showed care. A younger man might have split wood or carried water to show his love. But in later years, it might be enough to place a stool near the fire for her before she even asked. She might notice when his hands shook and offer to slice the bread instead. These weren't grand romantic gestures. They were acts of daily grace, and sometimes, when the village was asleep and the coals in the hearth glowed dimly, an old couple would lie side by side, listening to the wind press against the shutters. There were no whispered declarations, only the familiar sound of breath and the warmth of a presence that had been beside them for decades. Love, by then, had become less about emotion and more about rhythm, about knowing someone so well. You could predict their thoughts by the way they tied their shoes or stirred their tea. When one partner eventually passed, as they often did before the other, the grief was deep but quiet. The home felt larger, emptier, slower, but it was also full of memory. Every chair, every tool, every worn piece of cloth held traces of what they had built together. And the one left behind carried that story forward, not loudly, not tearfully, but with calm reverence, because in the Middle Ages, growing old in love wasn't about passion. It was about endurance, patience, and presence. The greatest love stories weren't told in poems or carved into stone. They were carried in the hands and hearts of people who stayed year after year, task after task, breath after breath. In the Middle Ages, death was part of life. It came early for some and quietly for others, but it never felt entirely unexpected. When one partner passed away, the other was left in a silence that could not be filled. The cottage remained the same. The hearth still warm, the bread still baked, the firewood stacked, but something within had shifted. Grief did not arrive loudly, it came as stillness. A hand reaching out in sleep and finding only the fold of a blanket. A cup set down for two, though only one would drink. People didn't speak much about their sorrow. There were no grand ceremonies, no long speeches. Instead, the mourning was folded into daily life. A widow might wear her old shawl longer than usual. A man might pause while walking past the place where they once sat together. The village would notice, but not intrude. They would offer warm bread, a kind word, and let time do its slow, quiet work. Love, once shared, didn't vanish when one person was gone. It remained, tucked into objects, gestures, and routines. A wooden spoon carved by their hand. A worn patch of fabric sewn with care. The sound of a song they used to hum while preparing the evening meal. These small things became anchors. Not painful reminders, but gentle echoes. A kind of second presence, always near, and in many homes, memory was kept alive in stories. Not formal tales, but casual mentions. Your grandfather used to say this, or she always planted time before the first frost. Children heard these words and learned not just about the one who was gone, but about the love that shaped their lives. The stories were soft, but they lasted. Passed down through meals, through songs, through how things were done. Some kept tokens, a wool cap worn through many winters, a ring wrapped in cloth, a letter never sent. They didn't look at these things every day. But when they did, it was with a kind of gratitude. Because even though love ended in time, it continued in memory. Not in sadness, but in stillness, and often, the one who remained found peace in routine. They would tend the same garden, keep the same seat by the window, stir the same soup recipe, not to live in the past, but to keep walking forward quietly, gently in the direction they once walked together. Because in the Middle Ages, love didn't end with loss, it changed form. From breath and voice to memory and presence. From touch to tradition. From two people to one, and eventually to many. As the story lived on in children, and in the work of daily life. And even as time passed, and seasons changed, and the world shifted again, that quiet, simple love remained. Not written down. Not sung in songbooks, but carried in the hands and hearts of those who remembered. Asterisk in the Middle Ages. When one partner died, it was not uncommon for the one left behind to live alone. Some remained that way for the rest of their lives, not because they feared new love, but because the shape of their heart had changed. Yet now and then, second love did come. It did not arrive like the first, with firelight and festival, dances, but more like a soft knock at the door, quiet, cautious, full of memory. In a small village. People noticed these things. A man who had kept to himself for 2 winters might begin walking with someone to the market. A widow who always sat alone during feast days might now share a bench. There were no public declarations, no new rings, just small shifts, a helping hand, a shared loaf, a glance that lasted a little longer than before. Second love, if it came, was rarely rushed. It came slowly, often between people who had known grief, who understood what it meant to miss someone every morning, and still light the fire anyway. There was no desire to replace what had been lost. Instead, second love was about companionship, ease, and understanding. It was about having someone to speak to again at night. Someone to walk beside, even if the path was shorter than before. And because life was full of labor and routine, second love often bloomed through shared work. A man might help repair a roof before winter. A woman might bring broth during illness. Not out of obligation, but something warmer, something hopeful. These gestures were not grand. They were quiet. And often they were returned slowly and without words. The village usually accepted such unions, especially when both had known sorrow. Neighbors saw not romance, but healing. A rebuilding of life. Sometimes there were children still in the home. Sometimes there were not, but either way, the house began to feel less cold. Meals were cooked for two again. Laughter returned, not loudly, but gently, like the sound of kindling catching fire. Second. Love did not erase the first. In fact, in many cases, it honored it. The memories remained. The old stories were still told. The name of the lost partner was still spoken aloud. But now they were joined by a new presence, someone who understood the quiet between words, the ache of anniversaries, the need for patience, and over time, what began as simple kindness deepened. Second love became steady, trusted. It became hands folded together on stormy nights. Footsteps matched again. Two people no longer young, moving through their final seasons with care, because in the Middle Ages, love could begin again, not by forgetting, but by gently learning to hope again. To hold someone else's hand, knowing how much courage it takes to open the heart after it has already been broken once. And those who found that kind of love, often quieter, often slower, were grateful in a way only time and loss could teach. In the Middle Ages, not all love stories began with affection. Many marriages were arranged, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Land needed tending. Families sought stability. A daughter might be promised by her father to a man she barely knew. A young man might marry because it was time to have a home of his own. Love was not expected at the start. What mattered was survival, and yet, love had a way of arriving anyway, slowly, quietly, not like a song, but like a seed placed in cold soil, unseen, but live. At first, life was awkward. Two people, now bound together, waking in the same room, sharing food and labor, but not knowing how to speak to each other. Some were shy, others distant. Trust had to be built from the ground up. Days passed in silence, in parallel work and small routines, but gradually gestures softened. A meal left out when one was late returning home. A coat draped over shoulders before a cold morning chore. She might learn how he liked his stew, with more root vegetables, less salt. He might notice she hummed while weaving and make sure. She had thread ready at hand. They did not say, "I'm falling in love." They said, "I'll carry that for you." Or, "The fire is warm already," or simply, "Eat first, I'll wait." These marriages, built not on passion but on patience, often became some of the strongest. There was no pedestal, no ideal, no early romance to chase. Just two people learning one another day by day, through illness, through harvests, through winter nights when the wind creaked through the beams and they lay listening, side by side. Sometimes love did not come for years, but it did come, often when they weren't looking for it. A laugh shared unexpectedly, a hand held not out of obligation but comfort. A deep, calming presence felt more with time. There were also marriages where love never grew, where the work was done, the children raised, but no closeness came. That, too, was part of medieval life. But many times, couples who began in distance, slowly, quietly, grew toward each other, like vines meeting at the top of a wall. And in old age, Those same couples would often be seen sitting close by the hearth. They would speak little but understand much. They had not fallen in love all at once. They had built it slowly across seasons and years, with patience and care, because in the Middle Ages, love did not always lead to marriage. But sometimes marriage, in time, led to love, asterisk. In the Middle Ages, distance could come without warning. A husband might be called away for war, a son sent to serve in another manor. A wife might travel to care for a sick relative or leave, to remarry after becoming a widow. Roads were slow, news traveled slower, and once someone was gone, there was no promise of return. But even across distance, love found quiet ways to endure. Few people could write in those days. Letters were rare, and when they were sent, they were often dictated, scratched out by a village priest, a clerk, or a merchant with ink-stained fingers. The words were plain, "I am well," or "I miss the sound of the stream behind the house," or "Tell the children I wait for spring." But for those who received them, such lines were precious. Read again and again until the paper softened the folds. More often, love was carried not in words, but in objects. A small token exchanged before parting, a lock of hair tied with, thread, a carved spoon, a wool scarf, a bit of ribbon. These things were kept in satchels, under pillows, inside cooking pots, close to the heart, touched in the quiet of night, held in the hand during prayer. A way of remembering that someone, somewhere, was still thinking of you. Sometimes, those who were gone would send small things home, a dried flower pressed in a folded cloth, a coin from another village, or simply a message passed by a traveler. "He is well. He asks after the garden." These scraps of contact meant everything. They tethered people to one another, even across rivers, borders, and long stretches of silence. Children, too, noticed. A child might watch their mother smooth a cloth again and again, not knowing it once belonged to the man they now barely remembered. And even though they couldn't name it, they could feel the presence of love in the way that cloth was handled. Not every separation ended with return. Many times, someone left and did not come back, but even then, the memory remained. The firewood was still stacked as he had done it. The stew was still made in the way she preferred. And on quiet evenings, a person might find themselves speaking aloud, not expecting a reply, but offering one side of a conversation that used to be shared. Some people never loved again after such a loss. Not out of bitterness, but because the love that had been was enough, complete, even if cut short. And so they carried it, not in mourning clothes or grand monuments, but in everyday habits, in the way the garden was tended, in the way the front door was kept shut on cold nights, in the rhythm of steps taken down the same familiar path. Because in the Middle Ages, even without messages or photographs, even without fast horses or written poems, love could survive distance. It lived in memory, in objects passed hand to hand, in words spoken quietly to no one, and in the faith that someone, somewhere, might still be watching the same stars and thinking of home. For much of the medieval year, life was routine. Days filled with labor, meals, and quiet rest. But every now and then, the pattern broke, and something brighter arrived. Festivals, holy days, feasts in honor of saints or the turning of seasons. These moments, scattered across the calendar, brought joy not only to the community, but to those in love or those still discovering it. A festival might begin with bells ringing at dawn, signaling rest from work. Banners would be hung, bread baked in extra loaves, and people would arrive from nearby villages. Songs were sung in the open square. Dances started before midday and carried on into the stars. Even the quietest souls would come out to watch. For couples, these days were a chance to be seen together, not in private glances or hidden gestures, but openly. A man might lead his wife to dance in front of others for the first time in years. A young woman might smile more freely as she passed the boy who had helped her carry firewood weeks before. It was not about spectacle. It was about acknowledging each other in a shared moment of joy. The music helped. Lutes, flutes, tambourines, all played familiar tunes passed down for generations. The melodies weren't grand, but they carried the feeling of belonging. Couples would sway to them slowly, hand in hand, or sit quietly at the edge of the gathering, feet touching under the table. Songs were more than entertainment. They told stories of lovers lost and reunited, of promises whispered under trees, of long journeys home. And for those who were in love, or once had been, these songs stirred memories. They reminded people of how things had started and how far they'd come. Some brought offerings to the festival fire, bundles of herbs tied together by two hands, or shared loaves baked with special symbols pressed into the crust. Others simply watched the flames and leaned against one another in the dark, and even after the music faded and the stalls were taken down, the feeling remained. The festival gave people a reason to smile at each other a little longer, to remember what they meant to one another beneath all the busyness of daily life. For the shy, the gatherings offered quiet courage, a chance to sit beside someone they admired, to listen to the same song, to share laughter that might open the door to something more dot for the old. It was a time to rest and remember. Watching the younger ones dance, they held hands with someone who had once danced with them long ago. And in that moment, they knew love doesn't fade, it changes shape. And even as bodies grow tired, the heart still listens for music, because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't only found in labor or loss. It lived in celebration too, in shared food, in shared fire, in a song that made two people look up at the same time. And in that moment, no one was alone. Asterisk in the Middle Ages, lessons were not always spoken. There were no schools for most people, no printed books on parenting, and very little writing at all in the homes of common folk. But knowledge still passed from one generation to the next, quietly, gently, by how people lived. And among the most tender of those lessons was how love was taught by example. Not in lectures or declarations, but in the way parents moved through the world and how they treated each other. Children grew up in small spaces, in cottages with just one or two rooms. There were no doors to close, no long corridors to separate people. Everything was shared: the bed, the fire, the work, the quiet. A child might fall asleep to the sound of spoons clinking in a bowl, or the hush of two parents speaking softly by candlelight. There was little privacy, and because of that, children saw almost everything, not in detail, but in rhythm. They noticed who rose first to light the fire, who added more oats to the pot so the others might eat more, who waited up until the last child was home. They saw how their father rested his hand on their mother's back when she bent over the garden, how she tucked his cloak around his shoulders when he dozed off by the hearth. These were not grand gestures. In fact, they were never called love out loud. But the children saw them again and again, and they learned what love looked like. It looked like kindness that didn't ask for attention, like noticing what someone needed before they spoke. Like patience, quiet, consistent, and steady. Many children in the village never heard their parents say the words, "I love you." That wasn't part of the language people used every day, but they heard other things. "Are your feet warm? I saved you the last piece. Wait, I'll walk with you." And slowly, they came to understand that love was not only a feeling, it was a behavior. But daily practice taught in some homes, the love between parents was more formal, less visible, less soft. Not all marriages were built on affection. Some were arranged and some remained distant. But even in most households, children could learn the value of consistency, of staying, of caring in different ways through duty, effort, or stability. And for those who grew up seeing both warmth and restraint, the lessons were complex, but lasting. They understood that love didn't always look the same, but it could still be carried carefully. One of the most common ways love was taught was through stories. At the end of the day, when the fire was low and the work was finished, children would gather around, not on chairs, but on rugs, on benches, or on the floor near the hearth, and listen. Sometimes the stories were old legends about saints or warriors. Sometimes they were fables with foxes and clever hens. But now and then, a parent would tell a quiet story about someone they once knew, a friend, a neighbor, a grandparent long past. In these stories, love appeared gently. A man who waited every winter at the edge of the woods for his wife to return from her sister's cottage. A woman who planted herbs on her husband's grave each spring so the garden would still bloom. A couple who saved up for years to buy a new kettle, not because they needed one, but because it had a smooth handle, and her hands were tired from the old iron. These stories stayed with the children, not just for their words, but for the way they were told, slowly, softly, without rush. The voice of a father carrying the same calm tone he used when lifting a child from sleep. The voice of a mother who paused to remember the exact way someone had laughed long ago. Love was passed along through these retellings, wrapped in memory, softened by time, and in daily chores, lessons continued. A mother teaching her daughter to knead dough would speak of how her own mother had done the same, how she always let the dough rise near the sunlit window, and how she sang the same tune while folding the cloth over it. A father showing his son how to sharpen a blade might say, "This is the way your grandfather did it. He always said a clean edge keeps us safe." And while the surface lesson was about bread or tools, the deeper one was about care, doing things with attention, out of love for those who will use them. In this way, love was tied to responsibility, not as a burden, but as a way of showing someone mattered. Children learned that you cared for what you loved. You protected it. You maintained it. You didn't speak of it often, but you showed it in how you kept a room swept, how you fixed a broken latch, how you remembered someone's small preferences and acted on them without being asked. And over time, the children began to mimic what they saw. A little girl tucking her doll under a corner of fabric before sleep, just as her mother tucked in her younger brother. A boy placing extra firewood near the hearth the way he'd seen his father do every night. These were small acts, but they revealed something larger, the quiet inheritance of love. The seasons also shaped these lessons. In winter, when everyone huddled closer to the fire, the need for care became more visible. Parents would check that blankets were dry, that boots were warmed before being worn. They would help dress little fingers into stiff sleeves. In summer, love was shown in rest, finding shade for a tired child, pouring water from a shared jug, letting someone sleep longer after a hard day. Even discipline, when needed, could carry love. Not through harshness, but through structure. A father might raise his voice not to wound, but to teach. A mother might withhold a treat not out of coldness, but to help a child grow more mindful. And when the lesson was learned, forgiveness was swift, a hand ruffling the hair, a bowl of stew passed across the table, a nod of approval. There were also families touched by loss. A parent gone too soon, a sibling who didn't survive illness. In these homes, the love that remained grew stronger. Children learned from grief, too, from the way a surviving parent carried on, tending to the fire, the food, the care of others. They saw that love was not erased by absence. It endured in routines, in memory, in the telling of names. When those children grew older and began families of their own, they carried these lessons with them. Not perfectly. No one ever does. But they remembered what it meant to be held, noticed, prepared for, and they tried in their own way to offer the same, to tuck the blanket, to stir the pot just so, to carry firewood when the sky turned gray. And even if they never said the words out loud, even if they never spoke of love in the way poets do, the lesson remained that love was care, love was effort, love was doing what needed to be done, without asking anything in return. That was what parents gave their children in the Middle Ages. No books, no speeches, just presence, gentle hands, and years of quiet example. And that kind of love, though slow and humble and never sung about, was strong enough to last across generations. In medieval villages, families were not always built like they are today. Life was shared not just between parents and children, but across a wider circle: older brothers and sisters, aunts who lived nearby, neighbors who came in and out of the home, and grandparents whose stories stretched back further than memory. And all of them, in their own quiet ways, helped shape how love was understood and passed on. Older siblings, especially, carried great weight. In homes where parents worked from dawn until dark, it was often a sister who helped tie shoes, or a brother who showed a younger child how to hold a bucket just right to keep it from spilling. There were no babysitters, no rotating schedules, only presence. A child learned how to care by being cared for by someone only a few years older. Someone who also didn't have all the answers, but tried anyway when a younger one scraped. A knee, it was an older sibling who wiped the dirt away. When food was scarce, they often gave up the larger portion. And when the sky turned gray with warning, it was they who took a small hand and let it back inside. These actions were not framed as love. They were simply part of life, but they were felt deeply. And later in life, those children often remembered not just the great moments of protection, but the small ones, the whispered comfort before sleep, the shared crust of bread when no one else saw. Beyond the family, neighbors played their part too. In tight-knit villages, every home was near. Walls were thin, and daily life spilled into the shared spaces between homes, the narrow lanes, the fields, the well. An older woman might stop a child and straighten their cap. A man passing by might lift a child onto a cart for fun or offer a spare apple. These gestures were small, but they taught children something lasting. Love didn't only belong inside one's own walls. It could be found in the village as a whole. Sometimes a neighbor stepped in when a parent was away or sick. They would cook a pot of stew and send it across the lane. They would sit with the children until someone returned. And from these moments, a child learned that care could come from many places, not just from those who shared their blood. And then there were the grandparents. The elders, often quiet, often tired, but full of memory. A grandmother might not move quickly, but she could braid hair with practiced fingers. She might hum songs no one else remembered, or stir herbs into tea with stories folded between the leaves. Her love was shown not with grand gifts, but with presence, sitting near the fire, always watching, always knowing. A grandfather might teach an old skill, how to mend a net, how to knot a rope, but more importantly, he offered time. In a world where adults were always rushing to finish the day's work, elders were the ones who moved slowly enough to match a child's pace. They listened, even when the story was long. They noticed when a child was quiet and sat beside them. Without needing to speak, through them, love became a thread, something passed not in speech, but in example. They had seen much, and even if they did not say it out loud, they offered the wisdom that love was not only for youth, not only for couples, it was something that belonged to the whole of life. Sometimes these elders had lost much, a partner, a child, a home, but they still gave, they still shared. And from them, children learn the shape of enduring love, love that lasts beyond grief, love that softens with time, love that gives without asking dot, and in many homes, it was the grandmother or grandfather who gave the final kiss before bed or told the last story of the night. That story, often repeated, became a kind of lullaby, softening the day, steadying the heart dot. So in the Middle Ages, love was not just something taught by mothers and fathers. It was something woven through every corner of village life. It passed from sibling to sibling, from neighbor to child, from elder to everyone who sat and listened dot. And though the world was harsh at times, and survival was never easy, still love found its way in shared chores, in warm bread passed across a fence, in an old story told by a voice that trembled slightly but never stopped, because even without lessons, and even without books, the people of that world taught each other what love looked like. Steady hands, shared burdens, and a presence that said without words, "You matter, I see you, I'll be here." Asterisk, in the quiet rhythm of medieval life, not everyone married. Not every person built a household or raised children. Some lived alone in their cottages or with siblings, and some shared their days with friends who stayed close across the years. Their love did not come from vows or rings, but from time spent together in work, in laughter, and silence. And in seasons that passed slowly, one after the other, dot friendship in the Middle Ages was not written about in the way romantic love was. Poets sang of knights and ladies, of longing and heartbreak. But in villages, in fields, and workshops, love often looked different. It looked like two people who always worked side by side, like one helping the other lift a heavy basket day after day without being asked, like waiting for someone at the edge of the path when they were late, not out of worry, but simply because it felt wrong to walk home alone. There were women who never married, who lived with another woman their whole lives, sharing bread, planting the same garden, finishing each other's thoughts. The village might not have had a name for what they shared. No one needed one. It was enough that they were always seen together, gathering berries, trading cloth, sitting shoulder to shoulder at the edge of festivals. They laughed quietly at the same jokes and remembered each other's dreams. There were men who returned from war and never spoke of it, but who found peace again in the presence of the friend they had grown up with. They might thatch roofs together in summer and mend fences in the cold. They shared tools, meals, and the same worn path through the woods. They didn't speak much about emotions, but when one fell ill, the other stayed through the night. And when one died, the other spoke his name softly at the fire for years afterward. Love between friends was often shown in acts, not words. A loaf of bread baked just the way they liked. A seat saved by the fire. A cloak passed across shoulders. When the wind grew strong, these were gestures that built something steady over time, something that didn't need to be declared. Because it was already known dot in harvest season, friends worked together from sunup to sundown. In winter, they made each other laugh to break the cold. In spring, they planned what to plant, arguing gently about beans or barley, but always deciding together in the end dot. When one friend lost a parent, the other helped with the burial cloth. When a house burned, the other offered a place to stay without asking for thanks. They had known each other since childhood, perhaps, or met by chance. But either way, their bond became something strong, a companionship woven through the fabric of daily life. Some of these friendships were between people who could never marry, perhaps because of their station or their families, or because the world wouldn't have accepted them. But they found a way to love all the same. And their homes, though simple, were full of warmth, not just from the fire, but from shared memory dot. As the years passed, they aged together. They helped one another through illness, supported one another through losses, and held each other steady as the world changed around them. Their love was not celebrated with feasts or songs. but it endured. And in the end, it became something sacred, a kind of love too quiet for stories, but too strong to be forgotten. Because in the Middle Ages, love was not always about romance or marriage. It could be found in the steady hands of friendship, in loyalty that never wavered, in care that never asked why. And for many, it was this kind of love, simple, faithful, and quietly shared, that lasted the longest. In the Middle Ages, most people did not speak of love openly. They didn't write poems about it, and they rarely said the words aloud. But it was there, not in grand declarations, but in shared labor, in the long rhythm of working side by side through every season of the year. For many couples, love began in the fields. They rose before the sun, walked together into the cold morning air, and bent their backs toward the same task, tilling soil, sowing seed, harvesting by hand. The work was hard and constant. But in that labor, something quiet grew between them. Trust, familiarity, the feeling of knowing that someone else was watching the same sky, sweating under the same sun, and would still be there when the work was done. They didn't say much as they worked. Talking was kept to a minimum, to save breath, to stay focused. But in the pauses between tasks, they exchanged glances. A quick smile when one of them slipped in the mud. A nod of thanks when water was handed over. These were small gestures, but they spoke more than words. Inside the home, the same kind of love unfolded. A husband sharpening blades while his wife stirred the stew. A wife repairing a basket while her husband swept the floor. They moved through the day not in separate worlds, but in a shared space, each task supporting the other. In many households, they didn't need to ask for help. One would see the other struggling and step in without speaking. When the bread dough was too heavy to knead, strong hands would finish the job. When the kindling grew damp, a second fire would be lit nearby. These were the quiet conversations of labor, silent but understood. Older couples, those who had worked together for decades, moved almost in unison. They didn't plan out loud. They didn't divide the chores with words. They simply knew from years of watching, doing, and adjusting. One would begin sweeping the floor, and the other would lift the stools before being asked. One would carry water, and the other would already have the pot boiling. Even friendships were shaped by this rhythm. Two women weaving at the same loom. Two men mending fences in the same light. Their love, the love of deep familiarity, grew through repetition. Through the shared memory of doing something difficult together and seeing it through. Love through labor wasn't romanticized, it was practical. But that did not make it less beautiful. In fact, it was perhaps more real, grounded in the mud, the wind, the soot from the hearth. It was the kind of love that helped raise barns, feed children, and get through illness. It was steady, reliable, and incredibly tender in its quiet way. On feast days or quiet evenings, couples and companions might rest together, their hands calloused from the week's work. They wouldn't always speak of what had been done, but the feeling of having endured it together lingered like warmth after fire. That too was love. And sometimes, during moments of unexpected ease, a sunny afternoon, a lighter chore, a bit of music from the next cottage over, they would laugh. Not loudly, but with the soft joy that comes from being seen and accompanied. A joy that only those who work side by side truly know, because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't about escape. It wasn't about escaping life or duty. It was about leaning into it, together. And those who shared their work also shared their hearts, and every basket lifted, every row planted, every loaf baked with two pairs of hands, and every night that ended with the peace of knowing, we did this, together. In the Middle Ages, people aged early. Hard work left its mark on the body, and the seasons wore down the joints and the bones. By the time a couple had shared 20, 30, even 40 years together, their steps had slowed, and their voices had softened. That love, the quiet, kind that had been built through decades of shared labor and long winters, remained. In old age, love was not loud. It was not full of surprises. It did not need to be chased or won. Instead, it settled, like a warm shawl placed over shoulders in the morning, or a shared cup of broth as evening came. It moved more slowly, but it was no less strong. The house that had once echoed with children's footsteps was now quieter. Sometimes grandchildren visited, bringing laughter and muddy shoes. But most days were simple, filled with the sounds of chopping, stirring, crackling fire, and creaking chairs. Two old souls moved gently through their home. One would light the candles without asking. The other would sweep the hearth, even if it wasn't dirty. They still did things for one another, not out of duty, but out of deep, instinctive care. The kind of care that comes from knowing someone's habits as well as your own. They spoke less than before, but their silences were full. They didn't need to say, "Are you tired?" They could see it in each other's posture. They didn't need to ask, "Shall we rest?" They moved to the bench at the same time, as if led by an invisible thread. They still remembered the years when things had been harder. The lean harvests, the illnesses, the losses. They didn't speak of them every day, but the memories hovered, not painful, not sharp, just present. And in the quiet, they honored those years. They didn't need to relive them, only to keep walking gently through life, hand in hand. After all of it died in old age, love became a kind of memory itself. A shared history that only two people could fully understand. No one else knew all. The small stories, the time they lost their way in the woods during their first winter, the sound of their first child's laugh, the way she always hummed when sewing, or the way he warmed his hands before touching her cheek on cold mornings. Now, their bodies leaned a little more into each other when they walked. They paused more often on the garden path. They sat longer by the fire. And sometimes, as the sun set, one would reach for the other's hand, not out of desire, but reassurance. A gesture that said, "You are still here." So am I. Neighbors noticed them. Children grew quiet around them. There was something sacred in their presence, not because they were wise, or grand, or different, but because they had stayed. Through everything, their love was not perfect. It had held arguments, stubbornness, missteps, but it had endured. And by enduring, it had grown humble. It no longer needed to prove itself. It simply existed, like the stones in the wall, like the worn path to the well, like the faded carvings on the beams overhead. And when one of them passed, as always happened, sooner or later, the other continued on, slowly, carefully, often in silence. But even then, the love remained. In the way they laid out 2 cups instead of 1. In the way they sat on the same bench as before. In the stories they told to anyone who would listen, because love by then had become more than a feeling. It was a way of being, a rhythm, a presence that lingered even after footsteps faded, and in this way, the Middle Ages held a kind of love, rarely written about, not the love of poems or songs, or young glances, but the love of quiet days, shared burdens, and staying. The kind that does not need to be remembered in books, because it's already written in the heart. In the Middle Ages, people knew loss well. Life was fragile. Illness came without warning, and weather could steal a harvest in a single day. Most lived not in fear, but in quiet awareness that every moment was a gift, and every presence was temporary. When love was lost through death, separation, or the simple passing of time, it did not vanish. It became something else, a memory carried forward. A widow might wake in the same bed she once shared, rising alone but still turning to smooth the pillow beside her. A man who had lost his companion might still pour 2 cups of tea, drink from one, and let the other sit warm for a while. as if part of the day's habit had simply slipped beyond the visible. There were no photographs in those days, no recordings, no letters from years ago. And yet people remembered. They remembered through the shape of the table, through the sound of a gate creaking in the morning, through the way the firelight flickered in the same corner where someone used to sit. Love after loss lived in the everyday, in the way a cloak was still hung by the door, in the careful folding of linens that once wrapped shared meals, in the small pauses when a name nearly left the lips and was swallowed back. Down like breath, some planted flowers where a partner once rested their hands in the soil. Others carried a token, a pin, a scrap of cloth, a carved bead, worn under the layers of clothing, close to the heart. These small objects were not shrines. They were bridges, ways to continue the conversation. Even in silence. In villages, neighbors respected the shape of mourning. They didn't ask too many questions. They knew that sometimes the deepest grief was shown not through tears, but through routine. A woman still lighting her husband's lantern at dusk. A man still baking bread in the shape she once favored. Time, the pain of loss softened, but the love remained. It didn't fade. It changed its form. It became part of the rhythm of life. A presence that stayed in the shadows, gentle and still, like a familiar tune hummed under the breath. Elders spoke their loved ones' names when stirring stew or when looking at the sky. Sometimes they spoke to them, out loud, without shame. Just a few words, a good morning, a comment about the weather, a soft wish for sleep. No one judged it. Everyone understood, because in that world, love was never buried with the body. It lingered in the things left behind. A worn chair, a favorite scarf, a pair of shoes left by the hearth. These weren't symbols of sadness, they were companions of memory, quiet reminders that love had once lived here, and in some way, still did. Children who lost parents carried the lessons in their own hands, the way bread was shaped, the way a pot was stirred, the way a lullaby was sung without thinking. That too was love continuing. Not clung to in sorrow, but passed gently into the next set of hands. And those who never loved again weren't always lonely. Some simply felt the love they had known was enough, deep enough to last through. Absence strong enough to guide them through all the days that followed. There were rituals, of course. Lighting a candle on a certain day, leaving a bundle of herbs by a grave, whispering a name during prayer. But mostly, love after loss was kept in the daily gestures no one else noticed. A seat that was never filled, a cup that was always washed. Gently, a path walked at the same hour each morning, alone but accompanied by memory. Because in the Middle Ages, as now, love did not end. It grew quieter, it settled deeper, and it became something no wind or time could take. Asterisk in the Middle Ages. When the day's work was done and the sky had turned the color of ash, families gathered near the fire. There was little light left, just flickering flames and a few soft lamps made of oil or tallow. The sounds of the village hushed, and in that slow, sleepy hour, stories were told. Some were ancient, full of dragons and knights, saints and miracles. But others were smaller, quieter, told not for glory, but for closeness. These were the stories that passed love from one heart to another, not by blood, but by voice, not loud, not dramatic, just memory, spoken gently across the firelight. A grandmother might begin, "Your grandfather once brought me a bunch of winter flowers, not from a garden, but from the hedge behind the church. They were nothing but dried stems, but he wrapped them in wool and said, 'It's not much, but it's all I saw today that made me think of you.'" The children listening might giggle at such a plain gift, but as they heard the story again each winter, always at the same point in the season, they came to understand love wasn't in the flowers, it was in the gesture, the thought, the noticing, over time, those little stories took on a kind of magic. Not the kind of magic with spells and potions, but the quiet magic of remembering. A young boy might hear about how his father used to sneak honey from the comb and bring it to his mother after a hard day. Years later, he might do the same for someone he cares for, not because he was told to, but because the story had become part of him. Sometimes the names in these stories faded. A great aunt, a distant cousin, but the feeling remained. The lesson, the warmth. And in this way, love became part of the family even when the people were gone. Villages had their shared stories. Two tales of two people who waited years to marry, or the farmer who crossed the river each spring just to leave a carved stone near a woman's window. The truth of these tales didn't matter. What mattered was how they were told. Slowly, repeated, passed on. And believed in households where grief had settled, stories kept the memory of love alive. A widow would speak of how her husband always knocked twice on the door, even when it wasn't locked. A man would tell his grandchildren how his wife would hum the same tune every morning while kneading the bread. These details, so small, so ordinary, were how love survived time. The children listening wouldn't always understand at first, but as they grew older, they would carry those fragments like pebbles in their pocket, comforting, grounding. And one day, they would tell them again. My grandfather used to say, my mother once told me, and with each retelling, the story stretched a little farther into the future. Love lived in these stories not because they were perfect, but because they were real, because they were remembered, because someone had taken the time to tell them again and again until the words felt like home. And when the fire burned low and the room grew quiet, someone would always say, tell that one again. And the story would begin, soft, familiar, and filled with a love that had never really gone. Because in the Middle Ages, the heart had no parchment, no ink, no book, but it had voice and firelight and time dot, and that was enough. And so we come to the end, not with a flourish, not with a grand farewell, but with a final candle burning low, and a soft wind brushing the shutters. Through these 40 parts, we've walked together through the quiet fields of the Middle Ages, not the ones of kings or crusades, not the ones taught in schools, but the ones filled with baskets and herbs, with footsteps on muddy paths, and with hearts that loved in the stillest, gentlest ways. We saw how love lived in the way someone warmed another's cloak by the hearth, how it passed through a loaf of bread left waiting, how it was carried in the hands of a tired father or whispered through stories spoken softly by Firelight. We saw that in a world without letters or poems, people still found ways to say, you matter. I see you, I'll stay. They did it through effort, through patience, through years of small things done for each other. And the truth is, even though that world is gone, those quiet gestures haven't disappeared. They echo when someone brings you a blanket without being asked, when a parent saves the last bite, when two old friends sit without needing to speak, when you pass down a story that was once told to you in a voice filled with care. That's medieval love, still alive, still moving softly from one person to another. No one remembers the names of those villagers. No statues were raised for them, but they built something lasting, not in stone, but in tenderness. And maybe that's all love ever really asks for. To be noticed, to be repeated, to be carried forward quietly like a candle lit from another candle until the whole room glows. So tonight, as you close your eyes, know this. Somewhere long ago, someone mended a cloak for someone they loved. Someone hummed while stirring a pot for someone who was tired. Someone waited at the edge of the woods for someone who would come home late. And though their names are gone, their love is not. It lives in the quiet. It lives in you. Good night. Thank you for walking through the past with me. Sleep well, and may all your days carry the kind of love that never needs to be spoken to be real.